In the vast darkness between stars, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists an unwritten law that even the most ruthless species dare not break. Never harm a young of a species known for its protective instincts. The Zephyrian Collective had ruled 17 star systems for over 3 millennia. They had enslaved entire worlds, harvested resources from dying planets, and considered themselves the apex predators of their corner of the galaxy. They had encountered hundreds of species. Some they conquered, others they simply eliminated. But they had never met humans. When the first human colony ship, the New Horizon, limped into Zephyrian space with failing life support and desperate families aboard, the aliens saw only opportunity. A new species to study, to catalog, to control. The adults would make adequate labors after proper conditioning. The young ones, well, they would serve as perfect test subjects for their biological experiments. It seemed like such a simple decision at the time. Commander Vextar personally oversaw the processing of the human refugees. The adults were separated and sent to work camps. The children, 43 of them, ranging from infants to teenagers, were transported to Research Facility Omega 7, a sterile complex hidden in the asteroid belt where the Collective conducted their most sensitive experiments. What the Zephyrians didn't know was that humans possessed something no other species in the galaxy had ever demonstrated, an absolutely unbreakable bond with their offspring, and a capacity for rage that could burn stars. What they were about to discover would reshape the balance of power across 17 star systems. The message that would soon echo through every communication array in Zephyrian space would be simple, delivered in broken but unmistakable galactic standard. You have our children. Give them back, or we will take them back, and you will not survive the experience. The Collective's response was laughter. That was their first mistake. Their second was believing that a species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel could pose any threat to their ancient empire. They would not make a third mistake, because when you cage human children, you don't just anger their parents. You awaken something primal that has been sleeping in the human soul since the first mother picked up a rock to defend her young from a predator. Something that turns ordinary people into forces of nature, that transforms love into an unstoppable weapon, that makes the impossible inevitable. The Zephyrians thought they understood warfare. They were about to receive an education. The evacuation alarms on the New Horizon had been screaming for 6 hours when Captain Sarachan finally accepted the inevitable. The colony ship's fusion reactor was dying, its magnetic containment fields fluctuating dangerously as they limped through unknown space. Behind her, 15,000 colonists waited in the cargo bays, their faces etched with the kind of quiet desperation that comes from watching your future slowly slip away. Contact on long-range sensors, Lieutenant Morris announced from a station, his voice cutting through the bridge's tense atmosphere. Multiple vessels, closing fast. Configuration unknown. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. After 3 weeks of drifting through empty space, any contact was either salvation or disaster. There was rarely anything in between out here, where the galaxy's smaller civilizations scraped by in the shadows of greater powers. The main screen flickered to life, displaying sleek vessels that moved with predatory grace. They were beautiful in an alien way, all flowing curves and biomechanical integration, like someone had convinced sea creatures to become spacecraft. The largest vessel dwarfed the New Horizon, stretching nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. "They're hailing us," Communications Officer Janet Park reported, her fingers dancing across her console. "Audio only, transmitting in, well, it's not any language I recognize, but the computers try to parse it." The speakers crackled, and an alien voice filled the bridge. It was melodic yet cold, like wind chimes made of ice. The universal translator struggled for a moment before words began forming. "Unknown vessel. You have entered territorial space of the Zephyrian Collective. State your origin and purpose, or prepare to be boarded." Sarah straightened in her captain's chair, smoothing her uniform. First contact protocols were clear, even in desperate circumstances. Especially in desperate circumstances. This is Captain Sarah Chun of the human colony ship New Horizon. We are experiencing critical system failures and request humanitarian assistance. We have 15,000 civilians aboard, including children. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. When the alien voice returned, it carried a different tone, something that might have been curiosity. Humans, you are new, unknown to our databases. Very interesting. Another pause. Prepare to be boarded. Do not resist, and your people will be processed efficiently. The word process sent ice through Sarah's veins. She'd studied enough xenobiology to know that different species had vastly different concepts of assistance. What might seem helpful to one could be catastrophic to another. What exactly do you mean by processed? She asked, but the communication had already ended. The boarding was swift and professional. Zephyrian soldiers flowed through the New Horizon-esque corridors like liquid shadow, their movements unnaturally graceful. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to shift between deep purple and black depending on the light. Their faces were angular, dominated by large, multifaceted eyes that reflected everything around them like dark mirrors. Commander Vextar materialized on the bridge without warning, his form shimmering as some kind of personal teleportation device deactivated. Sarah had barely enough time to register his presence before he was studying her with those impossible eyes. "You are the leader," he said, his voice now coming from a translation device on his chest rather than through the ship's communication system. "Fascinating. Your species shows clear signs of hierarchical organization. Yet I detect unusual emotional resonances among your people. Most intriguing. Commander, my people are dying," Sarah said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming at her to maintain distance from this predator wearing civilization like a costume. "Our life support is failing. We need immediate assistance." Vextar tilted his head, the gesture eerily reminiscent of a curious bird. "Yes, this presents an excellent opportunity for cultural exchange. Your people will be relocated to appropriate facilities where they can be studied, where they can be helped to integrate into collective society." The word choice made Sarah's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We appreciate any assistance you can provide. However, I'd like to discuss the terms of this arrangement. My people have rights, and we maintain our autonomy as a sovereign species." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Vextar's features. "Rights. Sovereignty. Such interesting concepts. You speak as if you have some form of leverage in this situation." Around the bridge, more Zephyrian soldiers materialized. They moved with casual efficiency, restraining the human crew with devices that created glowing energy bonds around their wrists. Sarah felt the cold touch of the restraints as they formed around her own hands, and the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. "The adults will be transported to Integration Facility Sigma 12, Vextar announced as if reading from a grocery list. "They will undergo psychological conditioning to ease their transition to productive roles within collective society. The process typically takes several months, depending on the species' adaptability." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "And the children?" Vextar's multifaceted eyes seemed to brighten with genuine interest. "Ah yes, the young ones. They represent a remarkable opportunity for study. Juvenile specimens often provide the most valuable data regarding a species' developmental patterns, neuroplasticity, and behavioral adaptation ranges. They will be transported to Research Facility Omega 7 for comprehensive analysis." The restraints felt like fire around Sarah's wrists as she lunged forward, stopped only by the energy field that activated between her and the alien commander. "You can't separate families. These are children, not lab rats." "Families." Vextar repeated the word as if tasting something exotic. "Another fascinating cultural construct. Tell me, Captain Chun, why does your species invest such significant resources in non-productive juveniles? Most efficient civilizations minimize such emotional inefficiencies." Sarah stared at him, understanding flooding through her like cold poison. These beings didn't just not understand human family bonds. They were fundamentally incapable of comprehending them. To them, children were simply smaller, weaker versions of adults with no special significance. "You don't have children," she whispered. "Your species, how do you reproduce?" "Through controlled genetic engineering and artificial gestation," Vextar replied matter-of-factly. "New individuals are created when additional population is required, with predetermined traits optimized for their intended functions. The concept of random reproduction and extended juvenile dependency periods is remarkably primitive." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. These aliens had no concept of childhood, no understanding of parental bonds, no framework for comprehending what they were about to do. They saw human children as nothing more than interesting biological samples. Throughout the ship, the separation had already begun. Sarah could hear it now. The crying, the screaming, the desperate protests of parents being torn away from their children. The Zephyrians moved through the corridors with mechanical precision, sorting humans like cargo, adults to the left, children to the right. "Please," Sarah said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "Whatever you want from us, we'll cooperate. Just don't separate the families." Vextar observed her with clinical detachment. "Your distress patterns are noted and will be included in our behavioral analysis. However, the research protocols are non-negotiable. The juvenile specimens will provide invaluable data regarding your species' cognitive development, stress responses, and adaptation mechanisms." Dr. Elena Martinez, the ship's head of pediatric medicine, was brought to the bridge in restraints, her face streaked with tears. Behind her came the children, 43 of them, ranging from 6-month-old baby Kevin in his mother's arms to 17-year-old Marcus, who was trying desperately to comfort the younger ones even as his own hands shook with terror. "Mommy!" 4-year-old Lisa Kim's voice cut through the chaos as she reached toward her mother, who was being held back by alien soldiers. "I want my mommy." The sound seemed to affect even some of the Zephyrian soldiers, their movements becoming slightly more hurried, as if they wanted to complete this task quickly. But Vextar remained unmoved, his multifaceted eyes recording everything with scientific curiosity. "The emotional responses are quite pronounced," he observed to one of his subordinates. "Make note of the vocalization patterns and physiological stress indicators. This data will be crucial for our initial psychological profiles." Sarah watched in horror as the children were herded toward a transport vessel that had docked with the New Horizon. Some of the younger ones were clinging to teenagers who weren't even their siblings, just other kids who understood that they needed to stick together. Others stood frozen in shock, overwhelmed by the incomprehensible nightmare unfolding around them. Marcus stepped forward, somehow managing to keep his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "Sir, please. Some of these kids have medical conditions. Tommy has diabetes, and Emma needs her inhaler for asthma. If you're going to take us somewhere, we need to bring their medications." Vextar's head tilted again. "Medical anomalies will be noted during the initial examination process. Genetic deficiencies may actually prove useful for our research into your species' biological limitations." The casual dismissal of children's medical needs as genetic deficiencies made Sarah's vision blur with rage. She'd been in space long enough to meet aliens with vastly different value systems, but this level of callous indifference to suffering was something entirely outside her experience. As the children were loaded onto the transport vessel, baby Kevin began crying, the desperate, heartbroken wail of an infant separated from everything familiar. The sound seemed to trigger something primal in every human within earshot. Parents strained against their restraints with renewed fury, their voices joining together in a chorus of anguish that echoed through the ship's corridors. But it was 8-year-old Sophie Martinez who broke Sarah's heart completely. The little girl turned back toward the crowd of adults, her face streaked with tears, and spoke in a voice that carried despite her sighs. "Don't worry, Mama. We'll be brave. We'll take care of each other until you come get us." The simple faith in that statement, the absolute certainty that her parents would come for her, hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was a child facing the unknown with courage, trusting completely in bonds these aliens couldn't even comprehend. Vextar made a note on a device strapped to his forearm. Interesting. The juveniles show signs of premature leadership development and group bonding behaviors. This suggests accelerated social evolution under stress. Very promising for our research. The transport vessel detached from the New Horizon with its precious cargo, disappearing into the void toward a research facility that existed only as a cold entry in some alien database. Sarah watched it go, feeling something fundamental break inside her chest. "You've made a mistake," she said quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. Vextar paused in his data entry. "Explain." Sarah met his multifaceted gaze directly, no longer caring about diplomatic protocols or species relations. "You think you understand humans because you've observed our technology, our social structures, our weaknesses. But you've just touched something you can't possibly comprehend. And what might that be? You've hurt our children." Sarah's voice was steady now, filled with a quiet conviction that made several nearby Zephyrian soldiers shift uncomfortably. "And you have no idea what that means." Vextar returned to his data entry with dismissive efficiency. "Your threats are noted and will be analyzed along with other stress responses. However, I believe you overestimate your species' capabilities. You are refugees, dependent on our assistance for survival. You possess no leverage, no significant technology, no allies in this region of space." He gestured toward the viewport where the transport vessel had disappeared. "Those juveniles will contribute valuable data to collective knowledge. In return, the surviving adults will be provided with purpose and structure within our society. This is a beneficial arrangement for all parties." Sarah said nothing more, but something had changed in her expression, something that would have alarmed anyone who understood the look of a human parent whose children had been threatened. It was the same expression worn by countless mothers and fathers throughout human history, from prehistoric caves to the depths of space. The absolute, unwavering determination to protect their young, regardless of cost. As the New Horizon was towed toward the Zephyrian integration facility, Sarah began planning. Not escape. That was impossible with their ship crippled and surrounded by alien vessels. Not negotiation. These beings had already demonstrated they couldn't be reasoned with. Revenge. The Zephyrians had made their first fatal error in a long chain of miscalculations. They had assumed that because humans were technologically inferior and currently helpless, they would remain so. They had failed to consider that desperation, combined with a parent's love, could transform ordinary people into something extraordinary. Most critically, they had failed to understand that taking human children wasn't just an act of research. It was a declaration of war against something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. The human spirit, when protecting its young, knew no limits. Integration Facility Sigma 12 existed in perpetual twilight, its corridors bathed in the purple-tinged illumination that the Zephyrians found optimal for their multifaceted vision. For humans, it created an environment of constant unease, where shadows seemed to move independently, and depth perception became a constant challenge. Sarah Chun stood in her assigned quarters, a sterile cube barely large enough for the simple cot and waste facilities, staring at the small viewing port that showed the asteroid field surrounding them. 3 weeks had passed since the separation, 3 weeks of what the Zephyrians call cultural integration programming. The sessions involved hours of exposure to collective history, philosophy, and behavioral expectations, all delivered through neural induction that left most humans drained and disoriented. But Sarah wasn't paying attention to the programming anymore. She was watching the other prisoners, studying the facility's routines, and, most importantly, listening to the conversations her captors thought she couldn't understand. The Zephyrians had made another critical error. They had assumed human linguistic capabilities were limited to the languages they had observed. They didn't know about Sarah's background in xenolinguistics or her particular talent for pattern recognition in alien communication systems. Over the past 3 weeks, she had been quietly deciphering their complex tonal language, picking up fragments of meaning from guard conversations and facility announcements. What she had learned made her blood run cold. The children weren't just being studied. They were being systematically broken down, their psychological defenses stripped away through isolation, controlled stress, and carefully calibrated trauma. The Zephyrians called it behavioral mapping, identifying the precise points where human will could be fractured and rebuilt according to collective specifications. The worst part was that it was working. According to the fragments she had overheard, several of the younger children were already showing signs of what the aliens termed adaptation syndrome, a psychological state where captives began to identify with their captors and accept their situation as normal. For beings who had never experienced childhood themselves, the Zephyrians found human children's adaptability both fascinating and useful. Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she remembered Sophie Martinez's brave words. "We'll be brave. We'll take care of each other until you come get us." That little girl's faith in rescue was being systematically destroyed, day by day, in some sterile laboratory where aliens studied her tears like fascinating biological samples. A soft chime indicated the beginning of another integration session. Sarah made her way to the communal area where the human prisoners gathered for their daily programming. But her mind was elsewhere. She had been working on something, a plan that bordered on suicide, but might be their only chance. Dr. Martinez sat in her usual spot, her once pristine medical uniform now faded and wrinkled. The woman who had dedicated her life to healing children looked hollow, aged decades in the past 3 weeks. But when she saw Sarah, something flickered in her eyes, a recognition of shared purpose. "Any word?" Martinez whispered as Sarah sat beside her. Sarah shook her head slightly, then leaned closer as if adjusting her position. Tonight, she breathed barely audible. Section 7. "Pass it on." Martinez nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned her attention to the holographic display that had materialized in the center of the room. Today's lesson was about collective resource allocation systems. Mind-numbingly boring for most prisoners, but Sarah used the time to finalize her plans. She had identified 17 humans among the 500 prisoners who possessed the right combination of skills and motivation for what she had in mind. Most were parents of the taken children, but a few were specialists whose expertise would be crucial. Former military personnel, engineers, medical staff, and communications experts. The plan was insane. It relied on assumptions about Zephyrian psychology that could be completely wrong. It required precise timing, improvised technology, and more luck than any reasonable person would count on. Most critically, it assumed that human rage, properly channeled, could overcome technological superiority. But as Sarah watched her fellow prisoners submit to another day of psychological conditioning, she knew they had no choice. Every day they waited, the children were suffering. Every day of delay was another day of torture, another step toward complete psychological breakdown. The session ended, and the prisoners shuffled back to their quarters for the sleep cycle. But 17 of them took slightly different routes, making small detours that brought them to Section 7, a maintenance area that Sarah had identified as having minimal surveillance coverage. They gathered in the shadows between massive air recycling units, their faces grim with shared understanding. These weren't soldiers or heroes. They were ordinary colonists who had volunteered for a new life among the stars. Teachers, farmers, mechanics, small business owners. But each of them had something the Zephyrians couldn't comprehend. Children somewhere in this godforsaken system, depending on them for rescue. "This is suicide," whispered James Parker, a former military engineer whose twin daughters were among the taken. "Even if we could somehow get to the research facility, we'd never make it past their defenses." Sarah nodded grimly. "You're probably right. But we're not talking about a rescue mission. We're talking about something else entirely." She activated a small device she had painstakingly constructed from salvage components, a crude holographic projector that displayed a simplified map of the local system. The research facility is here, hidden in the asteroid belt. According to the communications I've intercepted, it's completely isolated, designed to prevent any outside interference with their experiments. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, studying the display. How do we even reach it? We're prisoners, not pilots. We don't need to be pilots, Sarah replied. We need to be something the Zephyrians have never encountered before. Human parents who have absolutely nothing left to lose. She touched the projector, and the display shifted to show the integration facility's power grid. I've been studying their energy systems. The Zephyrians rely heavily on automated processes with minimal organic oversight. Their entire civilization is built on the assumption that their subjects will either comply willingly or be too frightened to resist effectively. Captain Torres, whose 8-year-old son Roberto was among the children, spoke up. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah's expression became deadly serious. We're going to teach them what it means to threaten human children. We're going to turn this facility into a weapon and aim it directly at their research station. The plan she outlined over the next hour was breathtaking in its audacity. They would simultaneously overload the facility's power systems and breach its communication arrays, creating a massive explosion that would serve as both a signal and a projectile. The facility's trajectory would carry it directly toward the research station, giving them perhaps 30 minutes to somehow reach the children before the collision. This is insane, Torres said, but his voice carried admiration rather than condemnation. Even if the explosion doesn't kill us, even if we somehow survive the trip through space, we'd still have to fight our way through an entire alien research facility. With what weapons? Added Maria Santos, whose daughter Carmen had been taken. We're unarmed civilians. Sarah smiled, and there was something in that expression that would have made a Zephyrian warrior step back nervously. We don't need conventional weapons. We have something much more powerful, the fury of human parents whose children have been hurt. She gestured to the group around her. Look at us. Really look. 3 weeks ago, we were ordinary people living ordinary lives. Now we're planning to turn ourselves into a guided missile and assault an alien fortress with our bare hands. That's not desperation. That's evolution. That's what humans become when you threaten our young. The group fell silent, processing the implications. What Sarah was describing wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a fundamental change in what they were as human beings. They were volunteering to transform from victims into something altogether more dangerous. Dr. Martinez spoke first. Elena is only 5 years old. She calls me Mama Elena because her real mother died during the journey. If there's even a chance. Count me in, said James Parker. My girls need to know their father didn't abandon them. One by one, the others voiced their commitment. Not because they believed the plan would succeed, but because the alternative, leaving their children in alien hands, was unthinkable. Over the following days, they began their preparations. Sarah used her growing understanding of Zephyrian language to intercept more detailed communications about the research facility. What she learned made her sick to her stomach, but also strengthened her resolve. The experiments were escalating. The aliens had moved beyond simple observation to active psychological manipulation, using the children's natural bonds with each other as leverage for compliance. They were forcing the older children to watch the younger ones suffer, then rewarding cooperation with brief reunions. They were studying how human protective instincts could be systematically broken down and rebuilt. Most horrifically, they were beginning what they called cognitive restructuring, direct neural intervention designed to alter the children's fundamental personality development. In their clinical reports, the Zephyrians noted with satisfaction that several subjects were showing decreased emotional volatility and improved compliance metrics. They were turning human children into Zephyrian thinking drones. Sarah shared this intelligence carefully with her conspirators, watching as each parent processed the implications. She saw the moment when desperate hope transformed into something infinitely more dangerous. Parental rage refined into pure, focused hatred. How long do we have? Torres asked, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. According to their schedule, The next phase begins in 5 days, Sarah replied. After that, she didn't need to finish. They all understood that once the aliens began permanent neural modification, their children would be lost forever, even if their body survived. The final preparation phase took on an almost ritualistic quality. Each parent wrote letters to their children, not farewell messages, but promises. Promises that they were coming, promises that they would never stop fighting, promises that no alien science could break the bonds of human love. Dr. Martinez created medical kits from supplies stolen bit by bit from the facility's infirmary. James Parker used his engineering knowledge to build crude but effective explosives from cleaning supplies and electronic components. Captain Torres organized the tactical elements, drawing on his military experience to plan their assault on the research facility. But it was Sarah who handled the most dangerous task, interfacing directly with the facility's computer systems. The Zephyrians used bioneural networks that required organic contact to access, and their security systems were designed to reject alien neural patterns. However, Sarah had discovered that prolonged exposure to integration programming had created unexpected pathways in her brain, pathways that might allow her to fool their systems long enough to trigger the overload sequence. The process was agonizing and potentially fatal, but Sarah embraced the pain. Every surge of bioelectrical feedback that coursed through her nervous system was another step closer to her daughter's rescue. Another small victory against the aliens who thought humans were just another species to be cataloged and controlled. On the night before their planned uprising, the 17 conspirators gathered one final time. They sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in thoughts of the children they were fighting to save. Finally, Sarah spoke. Tomorrow, we show the Zephyrians what they've awakened. Tomorrow, they learn that humans aren't just another species to be processed and filed away. Tomorrow, they discover that when you hurt our children, you don't just make enemies. You create something they've never faced before. She looked around at the faces surrounding her. Ordinary people who had been transformed by circumstances into something extraordinary. Tomorrow, they learn what it means to face human parents who have nothing left to lose. The facility's lights dimmed as the sleep cycle began, but none of the conspirators slept. They spent the night in final preparations, in quiet prayers, in last thoughts of the children who were depending on them for rescue. Outside the viewing ports, the asteroid field drifted slowly through space, unaware that in a few short hours, it would become the backdrop for a confrontation that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. The Zephyrians slept peacefully in their quarters, confident in their superiority and the absolute security of their systems. They had no idea that they had just completed the final day of their lives that they would spend believing humans were a harmless, primitive species. Dawn was coming to the facility, and with it, a revelation that would echo across 17 star systems. Never, under any circumstances, cage human children. The consequences the Zephyrians were about to discover were beyond their capacity to survive. The uprising began at 0347 hours, facility time, when Sarah Chun placed her hand on the bioneural interface panel in the main power distribution center and felt the alien technology recognize her neural patterns as compatible with their systems. The weeks of integration programming that were supposed to make her compliant had instead created the perfect biological key to their own destruction. The sensation was like touching a live electrical wire with her brain. Zephyrian bioneural networks operated on frequencies that human nervous systems weren't designed to handle, and Sarah felt her consciousness stretching and warping as she interfaced with the alien computers. But beneath the agony, she found something unexpected. The systems responded to human emotional intensity in ways their creators had never anticipated. Where Zephyrian operators approached the network with clinical detachment, Sarah brought 3 weeks of bottled rage and desperation. The bioneural pathways, designed to channel calm efficiency, suddenly found themselves flooded with the white-hot fury of a human mother whose children had been taken. The result was catastrophic for the system stability. Warning lights began flashing throughout the facility as power distribution systems experienced cascading failures. But this wasn't random destruction. Sarah was carefully orchestrating a specific pattern of overloads, creating a chain reaction that would culminate in the facility's central fusion reactor achieving critical mass in exactly 47 minutes. In Section 12, Dr. Martinez was implementing her part of the plan. She had spent weeks studying Zephyrian physiology during her integration sessions, noting their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. While their technology was advanced, their biology had evolved in low-stress environments that made them unprepared for the kind of brutal, close-quarters combat that humans had perfected over millennia of warfare. The first Zephyrian guard to investigate the disturbance in the medical bay never saw Martinez coming. She had fashioned a crude but effective weapon from surgical tools and mechanical components, and she used it with the precision of someone who had spent years studying anatomy. The guard's elongated neck made an excellent target for someone who knew exactly where to strike. Throughout the facility, similar scenes were playing out. James Parker had turned the maintenance tunnels into a death trap, using his engineering knowledge to create explosive surprises for any guards who tried to use them for rapid transit. Captain Torres was leading a frontal assault on the communication center, his small team moving with military precision despite their improvised weapons and civilian backgrounds. But it was Maria Santos who created the moment that would become legend among humans throughout the galaxy. Cornered in a corridor by 3 Zephyrian soldiers, she found herself facing their energy weapons with nothing but a length of metal pipe and the memory of her daughter Carmen's terrified face during the separation. "You want to see what a human mother looks like when you threaten her children?" she said, her voice carrying a deadly calm that made even the aliens hesitate. "Let me show you." What followed was 3 minutes of violence so intense and focused that the security recordings would later be studied by military tacticians across known space. Santos moved like a force of nature, her improvised weapon becoming an extension of her will. She absorbed energy blasts that should have killed her, ignored injuries that should have incapacitated her, and fought with a ferocity that transcended normal human limitations. When it was over, 3 elite Zephyrian soldiers lay dead, and Santos was still standing, bleeding, burned, and clearly in shock, but standing. She looked directly into the security camera and spoke words that would be repeated wherever humans gathered. "This is what you get for taking our children. This is just the beginning." The facility's command center erupted in chaos as Commander Vextar tried to understand how his perfectly secure installation was being torn apart by a handful of primitive beings armed with improvised weapons. His multifaceted eyes reflected the emergency displays showing system failures throughout the complex, but his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. "Impossible," he kept repeating as his subordinates reported casualty after casualty. "These are process subjects. Their psychological profiles indicate complete submission to authority structures. They cannot be capable of this level of organized resistance." Subcommander Kexlin, whose own research specialized in subject psychology, was frantically checking his data files. "Sir, I'm detecting massive spikes in neural activity among all human subjects. Their brain patterns are completely outside normal parameters. It's as if they've undergone some kind of fundamental neurological transformation." Vextar's attention snapped to the bioneural monitoring station. "Explain." The integration programming appears to have triggered an unexpected response in human neural architecture. Instead of creating compliance, prolonged exposure has somehow amplified their emotional processing centers while maintaining their cognitive abilities. It's as if we've accidentally created a more dangerous version of their species. The implications hit Vextar like a physical blow. The Zephyrian integration process was based on careful psychological manipulation designed to break down individual will and replace it with collective compliance. It had worked on dozens of species over thousands of years. But humans were different in ways his scientists had never anticipated. Human emotional bonds, particularly those involving offspring, operated on neural pathways so fundamental that they couldn't be rewired without destroying the subjects entirely. The integration programming, instead of overriding these pathways, had somehow strengthened them, creating humans whose protective instincts were amplified beyond normal biological parameters. Sir, another subordinate reported, we're reading critical power fluctuations throughout the facility. If these failures cascade, we could be looking at complete system collapse within the hour. Vextar turned his attention to the main display, where Sarah Chen's biosignature was showing as fully integrated with the facility's neural network. The human female in power distribution. She's interfacing directly with our systems. How is this possible? Unknown, sir. But she's causing systematic overloads throughout the facility. At current rate of cascade failure, we estimate 43 minutes until critical reactor breach. For the first time in his long career, Vextar felt something approaching fear. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were turning his own facility into a weapon. And if his readings were correct, they were aiming that weapon directly at Research Facility Omega-7. Contact the research station immediately, he ordered. Warn them of incoming threat and recommend immediate evacuation of all valuable research materials. But as his communications officer attempted to establish contact, they discovered another horrifying truth. The human assault on the communication center had been devastatingly effective. Not only had they destroyed the facility's ability to send messages, they had somehow turned the remaining arrays into massive signal amplifiers. Instead of evacuation warnings, Research Facility Omega-7 was receiving something entirely different. The voices of human parents promising to find their children, promising that no alien science could break the bonds of love, promising vengeance against those who had dared to hurt the innocent. The psychological impact on the research facility's staff was immediate and profound. The Zephyrians had studied thousands of species, but they had never encountered vocalizations that carried such raw emotional intensity. The human voices seemed to bypass their rational minds and trigger something primal in their nervous systems, an instinctive recognition of absolute, implacable threat. Dr. Sev Thak, the chief researcher at Omega-7, stood before his monitoring displays watching the integration facility's approach. His instruments showed a facility in complete system failure, its fusion reactor building toward catastrophic release, its trajectory locked on a collision course with his station. Evacuate the research subjects, he ordered his staff. All of them. Immediately. Sir, one of his assistants questioned, the human juveniles represent years of research data. Their removal would compromise multiple ongoing studies. Sevthak turned to face his subordinate, and for the first time since beginning his research, he truly looked at the human children in their containment cells. Through the transparent barriers, he could see them pressed against the walls. Their young faces turned toward the communication arrays as their parents' voices echoed through the facility. The children weren't cowering or confused. They were standing straighter, their expressions changing from despair to something approaching hope. Even the youngest ones seemed to understand that rescue was coming, but the promises they were hearing through the speakers were real. Look at them, Sevthak said quietly. Look at how they respond to those vocalizations. We've spent weeks trying to break their psychological bonds, and now their parents' voices are undoing all our work in mere minutes. He paused, studying the data streaming across his screens. We've been studying the wrong thing. We thought we were researching human child development, but what we've actually been studying is the most powerful force in their species, parental love expressed as absolute determination. The assistant looked confused. Sir, don't you understand? Sevthak's voice carried a mixture of scientific fascination and growing dread. We haven't just taken their children for research. We've created a situation that transforms ordinary humans into something far more dangerous than we ever imagined. We've turned parents into weapons. As if to emphasize his point, the facility's long-range sensors detected massive power signatures approaching through space. Not just the dying integration facility, but something else, something that shouldn't have been possible. Sir, the sensor operator reported, his voice shaking, I'm reading multiple human biosignatures in space. No life support pods, no protective equipment. They're somehow surviving in hard vacuum and propelling themselves toward our position. Sevthak felt his understanding of biology collapse. That's impossible. No organic being can survive unprotected space exposure. But the evidence was undeniable. The humans who had escaped the integration facility weren't dying in the void between stations. Instead, they were moving with purpose and speed that defied explanation, their life signs remaining strong despite exposure to conditions that should have killed them instantly. What the Zephyrians couldn't understand was that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Humans pushed so far beyond their normal limitations by love and desperation that they had transcended their own biology. The parents racing through space weren't surviving because of technology or special equipment. They were surviving through pure force of will. Sarah Chun led the group through the asteroid field, her consciousness still partially merged with Zephyrian bioneural technology, using alien systems to navigate paths that would have been impossible for human pilots. Behind her, 16 other parents followed trajectories that violated every known law of physics, held together by nothing more than determination and the absolute certainty that their children needed them. They weren't thinking about the impossibility of what they were doing. They weren't considering the fact that human beings couldn't survive in space, couldn't navigate asteroid fields without ships, couldn't maintain consciousness while exposed to hard radiation and absolute zero temperatures. They were thinking about Carmen Santos crying for her mother, about Roberto Torres asking when his father was coming to take him home, about baby Kevin screaming in an alien laboratory while creatures who had never known childhood studied his terror. As Research Facility Omega 7 came into view, a sprawling complex of interconnected modules hidden in the shadow of a massive asteroid, the human parents felt something they hadn't experienced since the separation. Hope. Not hope for rescue, not hope for survival, but hope for justice. The Zephyrians were about to discover that when you cage human children, you don't just anger their parents. You create something the galaxy has never seen before. Humans who have transcended every limitation except love. And love, as they were about to learn, was the most dangerous force in the universe.